Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
We were delighted to have Dr. Brian Cameron join us again on the Cold Steel Podcast. Dr. Brian Cameron is a now retired pediatric surgeon, and many listeners will remember our previous conversation with him a couple of years ago about global surgery and his work in Guyana. In this episode, we actually talked to Dr. Cameron about his new book, Ripples from the Rupununi, which describes the work and life of Dr. Aidun, a general and urological surgeon who worked for a number of years in Canada and then spent and dedicated many years of his life to serving folks in Guyana, particularly in rural and remote areas. This conversation is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, because it again highlights for myself and for our listeners the many talents that surgeons have and the many avenues that surgeons and surgical trainees can have in terms of making an impact on the world. Many surgeons would not think of writing a book as something that a surgeon can do, but obviously it is. And Dr. Cameron has written a wonderful book here. And he talks a bit about the process of what it takes to write a book and his impetus for doing so. Our conversation highlights, again, the challenges of working in an under-resourced environment and the personal and professional challenges that can come from doing so. Take a listen to the conversation, check out Dr. Cameron's book, and we'd love to hear your comments. Dr. Cameron, thank you again for joining us on the Cold Steel Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you back on the show. We were just saying before we started recording that it's been a few years since we chatted, and the last episode, which I'll put a link to in the show notes, it was actually during COVID, which kind of hard to believe that we went through that period of time. But we're very lucky again, and thank you again for spending the time and to kind of talk about your new book.
Actually, I wanted to congratulate you on episode, last I checked, 181 and counting of Cold Steel. I mean, I'm just amazed, Amir, and congratulations to you and Chad for persisting and growing this. I mean, it's obviously got an audience, and I had a chance to look back and listen to a few episodes as well, like Steve Foster and Joy Markstein. So you're really getting some great people on. I feel humbled to be invited back on a second time. I thank you for that.
I'll just take a tangent for a second, and I'll just say that, one of the things I didn't really appreciate is how much it was sort of like a living legend or a living record this podcast would end up being, having had some surgeons actually who have been on the podcast who have now departed this world, really. And, it's really quite special to have, in some small way, captured their voice and their thoughts and ideas. I was just re-listening to Robin McLeod the other day, who, as you know, passed away recently, and she was our first guest on the podcast. So anyways, it's been really a wonderful experience being a part of this whole journey. I wanted to talk to you about your book. And I think that was, one of the ostensible reasons to have you back on the show, which is Ripples from the Rupununi. And correct me if I'm not saying that correctly. And this book, just to give a synopsis, follows the story of Dr. Aidun, who is a general surgeon, urologist, who ended up going to Guyana and playing a big role in establishing healthcare and doing a lot of important work in Guyana, particularly in Epub, which is a more remote part of Guyana. But I wanted to start by asking you, and obviously we know how passionate you are about Guyana, how passionate you are about global surgery. What was the impetus to sort of, once you retired, to actually sit down and write a book about this?
I mean, as you know, Amir, I spent a lot of time in Guyana during my pediatric surgery career. I went, in fact, I was adding it up. I went to almost 30 times over a period of a couple of decades, mainly focused on helping them develop their own surgical training program. And you came with me on one of those trips. And that program was located on the coast of Guyana, the Caribbean coast in Georgetown, which is the capital city. And that's really where most of the population is. But the reason I went to Guyana in the first place was because of Dr. Aidun. And that was sort of the prequel, if you like, to my story. So this book is not my story, but it's sort of how I fit in a little bit, but it's mainly Dr. Aidun's story, as you said. And I was trying to, it's sort of like The Hobbit to the Lord of the Rings, you know. Like, oh, I don't know if that's not saying that, I'm not saying I'm the Lord of the Rings. That's kind of funny. At any rate, it's the prequel. It's the reason I went there. And the reason I felt the need to write the book was that I'd had this experience. I'd admired him. I know the importance of stories in motivating me in my life, and particularly from other surgeons who've had unique experiences. And he's really a global surgeon, and that is an area I'm very interested in. But I think what cemented it for me was more than 2 years ago, my wife Pat and I returned again to Guyana, but this time, instead of going to Georgetown, where we usually went, we went back to the Lethem you mentioned, which is called the Rupununi region of Guyana. It's very remote. It's very difficult to get to. I had not been there in 25 years, but this is where Dr. Aidun had spent most of his time. And so I went there looking for, what's happened a generation later. Does anybody remember the man? And I was astounded at some of the stories I heard, and that really motivated me to share their stories as part of the book. As you mentioned, I knew I was writing a biography, but it's really more of a journey. And I wanted to be able to bring along the reader on the journey that Dr. Aidun went on, and that I went on after him. So Guyana is in the north coast of South America. It's an English-speaking country, population about 750,000. So not a big population. 30 years ago, a generation ago, when I first went and Dr. Aidun was living there, it was the second poorest country in the hemisphere. It had maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates that were very high, like 20 to 30 times that of Canada. It had really gone through a couple of decades of great difficulty with the economy, people leaving, migrating out to North America. And so it was really, and the Rupununi region is in the southern part of that country. So I mentioned the coast, which is where the sugar plantations are, and that's where Demerara sugar comes from, by the way. And then after that, going south, there's the rainforest, which is spectacular and beautiful. And I can't remember if you had a chance to go there, but amongst other features and sights to see, there's Kaitru Falls, which is the tallest single drop waterfall in the world, 3 times higher than Niagara. And if you continue going south, then you reach this savanna region, so a little bit of cattle ranching, subsistence farming, mostly Amerindian indigenous people who live in the Rupununi region, which is the savanna, and only about 17,000, so a small population. But the Rupununi itself is about the same area as Nova Scotia. So if you compare that and imagine that small number of people in an area the size of Nova Scotia, but without any roads or communication, 40 isolated villages, you get some picture of the setting that Dr. Aidun went to. So maybe I'll come back and try and answer your question. Was I always thinking of writing about this, or was it a retirement project? And, to be honest, I've always had this file box, and I've collected stuff about Guyana in that box over the years. And I thought, I have written a couple of academic papers, as you know, about the training program, but I thought the story of Dr. Aidun was always in my mind. Now, he is, I don't think you had a chance to meet him, but he is a very, as you gathered from the book, he's a very humble guy and very atypical of a surgeon. And so just soon after I retired, I went to visit him, because by this point he was living in Toronto and in his 80s, late 80s. And I went to visit him, and we were chatting, and I said, maybe you should write a book about your experience in Guyana. And he said, oh, no, I'm not a writer. I'm not a writer. And as I thought about it, I said, well, let's talk on Zoom. This was one of the great benefits of COVID, is we all got used to Zoom. I recorded some interviews with him. And about 6 months later, when I went to visit him again, he said, oh, you might be interested in these. And he pulled out a stack of diaries that he had kept from during his time in the Rupununi. And I started reading them. And And that's where so many of the stories in the book come from, his diaries, including, I'm sure you were impressed with some of the surgical cases he had to deal with there with very little resources. Stab wound to the chest, a prolapsed arm, and a mother with a ruptured uterus, and, things like that. So he recorded those kind of stories, but he also recorded his own feelings and challenges just dealing with that situation.
Yeah, I was really struck by a number of things about Dr. Aidun, and I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the man, because much of the book is about him and is drawn obviously from his memory. It was very hard. Like, you definitely got the impression from reading the book about how difficult this whole process was. There was nothing really glamorous, particularly at the beginning, about the work that he was doing. You talk at length in the book about just the living conditions that he himself lived in when he first made it to Lethem. Like the first house that they put in had all these rats crawling all over the place, and then even the subsequent places they moved him into didn't have running water. This was not this is very different than I think a lot of the missions that folks go on, where they come for 2 weeks, they have a great time working with a bunch of people that they know. And again, I'm not disparaging that, but it did strike me that the type of work that this man put in was very unsung, very difficult, and he himself was in quite a difficult situation. I'm not sure if you had thoughts looking back at the early days of him working in Guyana, yourself working in Guyana, and looking back, if you think like, wow, that was really tough what he and others went through.
That first visit, he was living in that very house that you mentioned, and I remember him filtering his water, pouring and which he gathered from the river, plugging in a little fluorescent bulb, 18 inches long, into a car battery to give some light in the evening. That was all because he didn't have electricity in the house either. What he was able to do and not complain about his own situation obviously was very inspiring. And for sure, I think for him, the root of this was very much based in his faith. And I try and talk about that also in the book. He was born in Persia, had a difficult upbringing as a Baha'i in Persia, a member of the Baha'i faith, because they were persecuted by the reigning mullahs that were very fundamentalists at that time, and now. And then he ended up training medicine outside the country in Pakistan, and in coming to the U.S., to Syracuse, to do his surgical training. And an opportunity came up to go to Winnipeg, where he trained in urology, and then finally settled in Brandon, Manitoba. So he followed a route of training and experience, including with his family, along with him, that was very different than my experience. I mean, I was concerned a little bit. Can I really relate the experience that he had as an immigrant coming from elsewhere to Canada? As 25% of Canadian doctors have trained elsewhere. So that was a big part of what shaped his character. The experience then in Guyana, much later in his career, when he was 60, was not something that he chose to do. It was something he was asked to do. He did that out of a sense of service.
The fact that you had access to his diaries was really powerful. Like, to be honest, some of my favorite parts of the book were actually the little excerpts and forays into his mindset and his psyche. Like, there's all these he's almost like he kind of has to exhort himself or buck himself up. He keeps reminding himself at points, remember why you were here. Try to connect with God again and remind myself, why am I here? And at times you could tell that he must have been quite lonely and perhaps even depressed. That was a really powerful part of the book for me, was just, to do something like this is not easy. And you talked a bit about the high faith and how that was important to both to him and to you. Can you talk a little bit more about how do you think that the role that played in his life, and perhaps even a little bit about in your life and the motivation it provided for you to do all the work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, this is how I met him. As I mentioned, Dr. Aidun was born in Iran, which is where the Baha'i faith originated. So his parents were Baha'i, so in a sense he was born into the Baha'i faith. However, when he was a teenager, he was ready to reject it because he got kicked out of school because he was a Baha'i. So he thought, this is totally worth it. And so he tells the story of how his own faith was affirmed when he was a teenager. My story, on the other hand, is I came in contact with the Baha'i faith when I was at university, and first year university. So it was something I learned about, and having grown up as Presbyterian, I chose to become a Baha'i really because I found it resonated with my sense that, we live in a world with many faiths, and this was a way to me of explaining there's a creator. He has spoken to us through all these various messengers, and the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, is the most recent one of them. I was just thinking this week about analogies in medicine. And, it's almost like best practice guidelines for your soul. So that's kind of how I take it at a personal level. But secondly, the Baha'i faith is very much an international religion, and the community building aspects of it, the trying to bring humanity together aspects of it are very real, and I felt it was something that I could be part of. So he and I were connected through that community. But most of as I mentioned in the book, the place this health project was working, there were very few Baha'is. So it was mostly within a Christian community. And so it really had to be careful. The motivation of the project was definitely not to make conversions. It was to deliver service and work with the people and build the capacity of the community.
It just so happens that a number of our last few guests have been people who, their faith has meant a lot to them. And it just so happened to have also been a little bit of a global surgery kick with Dr. Foster, Mark Simon, obviously with yourself. So I was listening to the episode that we did, and you talked about Immanuel Kant's 3 rules for happiness. Can you remind us what those 3 rules are?
Well, you're the one who listened to it.
Oh man, now I'm gonna have to look back. But it was something to believe in, something to look forward to, and someone to love. There's something to that.
I got a follow-up to that, actually.
Okay, I want to hear it.
Even better. Jane Philpott, former Minister of Health, she's someone who would be a good interview for you. She's not a surgeon, but she's got an important role in our province now in primary care. And obviously, she was your dean there at Queen's. So you
Absolutely.
At any rate, I don't know if you've had a chance to read her book called Health for All.
Mm-hmm.
Recommend it to your audience. She is a family doctor and, as I said, a former Minister of Health. And most of the book is about the reformation of primary health care in Ontario, how to fix it. But the second chapter is entitled Spiritual Health. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? Minister of Health talking about health for all. And one of the chapters about spiritual health. And she defined that sort of similar to the Kant topics you mentioned, which spiritual health really consists of 4 things. Hope, so hope for the future, optimism, belonging, having family, community, to be with, love. Thirdly is meaning, so, having, which often comes through service to others. And I think this is where global health and many of your guests have found their focus for service. And then finally, purpose, and that's, again, one of Kant's things, I think, is having something to look forward to, something to do, having a goal and a plan. And for me in retirement, just to go all the way back to this, this has been a great project for me I've been working on for, almost 4 years, actually, to get it to the publication stage. So I think these 4 things, hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose, are elements that as surgeons, we really can incorporate, whether we believe in a God or a faith or soul, we can still incorporate those things to improve our spiritual health and try and find some balance, with all the stuff that we do every day.
Absolutely. I do want to talk to you a little bit about the writing component of this because, it's not common for a surgeon necessarily to have written a book that will go in the lay press. Obviously there's some pretty big examples of surgeons who have done that, like Atil Gawande, but certainly not a common thing. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the writing process for you. What was that like? I'm sure you approached it with a similar kind of surgical zeal that you would have approached everything else in your career. But what was that process like for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about as surgeons, with medical doctors, we're very used to taking people's history, right? I mean, we're used to listening. And I think that was the first lesson for me, was to learn, as you are doing very well, learning how to interview people. But I already had some skills in that, but it was important for me to listen and get the authentic story. And think my goal here is I have to tell this story correctly. And especially because Dr. Aidun is still alive. He is, 96 now. And it was very important to me that he and his second wife and his daughter, who I also know well, that they all were on board with this way the story was told. So in terms of the writing process, the interviews and research was pretty straightforward. That was really fun. And as I mentioned, traveling, interviewing people in Guyana, finding old photos there. The actual writing, again, I wanted it to be engaging, not just a chronological biography, but to sort of highlight some themes, perhaps. But as you said, I've never written, a book like this. I've written scientific papers. So I wanted to get feedback from people, and I was very grateful to get initial feedback on the first few chapters. Actually, Jeff Blair, my mentor from Vancouver, gave me some really useful feedback at the beginning. And then, others who are writers or others who are family members gave me good feedback. So finally, I got it to the stage of, well, how do I go about publishing this? Because that's the next challenging thing, right? Have you published anything like that?
Not an actual book, no.
Okay. Well, even when you publish, I know you published some scientific papers, and even that, is a process, isn't it? Getting it peer-reviewed, accepted for publication. These days, you even have to pay to publish, probably a lot more often than not. So I did send it off to a commercial publisher initially. And it was, a few months later, it was nicely rejected. And then I thought, okay, I'm just going to do this myself, but I don't really know much about it. So I ended up going with Friesen Press, and your listeners can look them up online. And I will highly recommend them. So this is basically a Canadian publishing house that works with authors. You can purchase whatever services you want. So, they helped me with editorial review, with the book design and cover. And the final, through the publication, they do the book printing, and they assist with marketing, and it's, they put it out there. So it's available through typical online retailers, Amazon. It's also in Kindle version. And, they had also helped give me some advice about how to present it and share it, more broadly. So that's what I'm becoming a book marketer right now. But it's fun. And I'll say I appreciate your comments. And to be honest, I'm very happy with it. And I'm also very happy with some of the reviews I'm getting. And in 2 weeks, I'll actually be in Calgary making a presentation at an international conference about the book. So I'm excited about that.
Well, congratulations again, Dr. Cameron. This is really, I think, an important thing that you've done on multiple levels. I think Dr. Aidun's story is an important one to tell. I think the story of Guyana is an equally important one to tell. And I think, lastly, it's a reminder to all of us about the ongoing work that needs to be done across the world and the inequity that continues to exist. So it's hard sometimes to keep your chin up when you're listening to the latest thing on the news cycle. But that's not the sense that I got from your book. The overwhelmingly, there's a sense of optimism and energy and enthusiasm throughout the book. And I think we're getting a sense of you. You brought Dr. Aidun to the page, but I think we also get a sense of Dr. Cameron through the pages as well too. So once again, thank you so much.
I mean, the title ripples, as I mentioned, the sequelae, what's happening now. This isn't just a story from 25 years ago. And so I think it is a positive book. But the example is that, in Hamilton at McMaster currently, we have Guyanese postgraduate trainees in almost every specialty that are coming here to do fellowships. All this began with the surgical training program that began because of my contact with Dr. Aidun. We've had dozens of Guyanese trainees come to Hamilton. They've gone back to Guyana. They're making a big difference in their own medical system. Guyana will be hosting the Bethune Roundtable on International Surgery next year, October 2026. And finally, I think, Guyana is getting more in the news. We don't even need to get into this because I don't know too much, but it's a very interesting time in national life now. As you probably know, they've got oil flowing offshore. So Guyana now, 25 years after being the second poorest country in the hemisphere, is now the fastest growing economy in the world because of oil. When I went back and met with the Minister of Health, he said, you know what, Brian, our health budget this year is 47% higher than it was last year. Can you imagine the impact that would make in Canada? We just think about shrinking budgets. They're building 7 new hospitals. They're training more doctors. Instead of Hamilton subsidizing all the trainees completely when they come here, Guyana's paying something to help train their doctors in Hamilton. So, economically, they have an opportunity now. As you know, petrostates can go multiple ways, but so far with the leadership they've had, it seems that the priorities are education and health, and it's a country of the future. So stay tuned, and there'll be more in the news about Guyana, I'm sure.
I want to end by asking you if there's any young surgeons out there who are thinking of doing something similar, some projects, whether it's writing a book or even frankly, getting more involved in global surgery or doing any kind of really big project like this that takes years to do. What advice would you have for them?
I thought you were going to ask a different final question.
Oh, the final question that we usually ask, but we already asked that to you. Do you have a different answer?
I'll have a slightly different answer.
Okay, I want to hear it. So the usual question we ask is, you can go back in time. You can go back in time and give yourself advice. What advice would you give yourself?
Well, that's the question I thought you were going to ask. So, see, I have the advantage. I can answer whatever question I want.
I love that.
Well, so I asked my 99-year-old father that question last week. So he is also a pediatric surgeon in Hamilton, and he's obviously long retired. He'll have his 99th birthday in 2 weeks. And actually, on a serious note, he said, his advice, given that he was 10 years the only pediatric surgeon in Hamilton, and when I was growing up, I rarely saw him, his advice was value your family over your personal ambition. So, for example, he never joined the golf club. Any spare time he had, he spent with his family. And personally, I think I would say the most important thing in my career, in addition to my family, has been having reliable partners. I'm sure you're finding that as well, reliable professional partners.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much again for joining us.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.